Joining us once again is Professor Richard Wolff. I've been looking forward to talking with him about a couple of topics. For those of you who haven't tuned into our conversations before, Professor Wolff is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the program of international affairs at the New School University in New York City, and he is host of the program Economic Update on Free Speech TV, Tuesdays from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern. So first of all, thanks for rejoining us, as always.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
So there were a couple things that were on my mind to talk to you about. And one of them was a friend of mine died on Christmas Day, William Greider, a journalist who wrote a lot about economic issues, financial issues, wrote a book on the Federal Reserve, wrote a book in the late 90s about globalization, one world ready or not. And, I talked about William Greider a little bit on the program last week, but you and I have talked a little bit about, in fact, a lot, I think, about how the economics profession failed to really fully absorb the lessons of it should have learned, one would think. I don't want to speak for you. This is my interpretation, empirically, from, for example, the financial crisis of 2008. But I also think that journalists like Bill Greider were more the exception than the rule, in the sense that I would have expected my own profession of journalism to learn more from that experience too. And I don't feel as if it did, but I'd be curious to know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I always admired the work of William Greider. And I noticed when he died on Christmas Day, just past, that it would represent a loss of what is a pretty small collection of journalists who both know economics pretty well and who are able to develop a critical perspective and not to be shunted aside or dismissed, even when the heavies of the profession go after them, mostly on ideological grounds, but in the manner of professional economists, they have to almost always couch their ideological dismissals as if they weren't ideological dismissals, but were instead a kind of scolding of the journalists for not having mastered the economics. It's a fakery, it's kind of shameful, but it's very old. Let me give you an example. When I was a graduate student at Yale University getting my PhD, a group of us, graduate students at the time, were disgusted and angry that there was no Marxist economist on the entire faculty. Nobody teaching economics at Yale University taught a course, let alone an honestly balanced course, about what Marxian economics had to offer, in the way of a criticism of capitalism, which is what Marx himself was engaged in, or, if you like, a discussion of the efforts to apply Marxism to a post-capitalist economic project. And so we demanded to get one. And the answer given to us by the professors leading the department, and remember, these were the people in whose classes we sat every day. They knew us all personally, as well as seeing us as the next generation. They consistently told us there was no one qualified to teach such a course. And I remember all of us looking at each other, not because we found the argument persuasive, it was ridiculous, but that our teachers, for whom we had such respect, would suddenly become laughable and unrespectable by what they said. So we came up, for example, with the proposal of a very famous economist at the time, Paul Sweezy, S-W-E-E-Z-Y. You may know of his work. He was arguably the leading Marxist economist in the 20th century here in the United States. He had gotten his PhD at Harvard. He had been so successful there that Harvard made him a professor. He was scheduled to be the successor to Alexander Gerschenkron, an even more successful, famous professor at Harvard. He could not get that job because the McCarthy period of the 1950s intervened, and because of his interest in Marxism, his career was shut down in what can only be called an ideological repression or witch hunt. But that he was qualified, that the dozen or more books that he had written, translated into 50 different languages, globally respected, that he wasn't qualified to teach at Yale was an argument equivalent to insisting that the earth is not only not round, but is shaped like a large donut with an arrow through the middle. And so the preposterousness of it was constant. And so when Paul Krugman, to take a modern example, attacked William Greider a few years ago for not knowing economics, it was transparent again that the economics profession did not like critics. William Greider was a very powerful critic. Some of the things he wrote at the time of the bailout of corporations in 2008 stand now, many years later, as the most profound and insightful commentary there is by economists or journalists. So I would summarize my response by saying, look, our journalists, to be real honest, aren't terribly well versed in economics. We don't require that of journalists, which is a problem. But the critique the profession makes of them is 90% ideology driven, and only 10% has anything to do with the specifics of what these folks write.
Again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff, and I had a couple thoughts while you were speaking. One is obviously, one sees the ideology at work here, and for example, Paul Krugman's attacks on Greider over globalism Greider's been vindicated, as far I think any reasonable person would agree, by history. But it also, it seems to me there are two things that the economics world does. One is a kind of show trial of a William Greider or anyone who dares to critique from outside the profession. And then, especially with the story you told, for some people inside the profession, it's almost as if people are, they used to say about, some totalitarian countries, someone's declared a non-person. I was thinking of, I don't want to be unfair, I think it was Ben Bernanke, but I'm not sure. Somebody after the financial crisis said, nobody we knew was saying that there's going to be a problem. And somehow that occurred to me that when you stray from the ideological field that you're permitted, that it's almost as if you either get condemned or you become invisible, and those are the forms of enforcement. Is that more or less right, you think?
Absolutely, and I speak from within the profession. Let me be very personal, because you can use me as an example. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. When I finished, I went to Stanford University, where I got my master's degree in economics. Then I went to Yale University, where I got a second master's degree in economics, a master's degree in history, and a PhD in economics. So I'm like a poster boy for elite American education in economics. If I'm not reasonably well trained, who is? The doctoral dissertation I wrote at Yale was considered good enough that the Yale University Press asked me to revise it and published. The first book I ever published is a book published by the Yale University Press. And the second book I published was published by the University of Chicago Press at a time when the board of editors there included a Milton Friedman. So I don't know, what do you have to do to be qualified? But if you take a position, as I do, critical of capitalism, yes, you become either, you might call it a non-person. The phrase I like a little bit better is that the economics profession lives in a self-referential bubble. They all know each other. Indeed, they all know me because I'm part of the old boy network because it's overwhelmingly white and male. And they know me. They know who I am. I know them, in some cases personally. But in terms of what I do, they don't want to know about it. They don't understand it. It's very awkward for me because I have to know the neoclassical and Keynesian economics that the profession specializes in and teaches, because I've had to teach it all my life. So I can talk with them about what they do. But when I start to explain, for example, how I have benefited from and make use of theories and arguments in Marxian economics, they can't follow what I'm doing. It's not because they aren't smart. They're perfectly smart people. But they've never done that work. They've never had a course. They've never studied it. They never worked their way through Marx's Capital to kind of get that stuff into their brain so they can use it. And so they are in this very uncomfortable place for professors where they would have to say to me, if they were honest, I'm sorry, I don't know that. Could you teach me enough so we could have a conversation? Very few professors are able to say that to one another across any kind of discipline, which is not a compliment, but it is the reality. And so I exist outside that bubble. Ben Bernanke didn't talk to people like me. And let me assure you, I am not alone. I was one of the people who said I didn't think the bubble of the early years of the 21st century was sustainable. But you could even have people with no political leftism to them. I think of one of the most famous, a professor of business at the NYU Stern School of Business by the name of Nouriel Roubini. You may know his work.
Absolutely, yeah.
He was he got the nickname Dr. Doom because he was saying long before the crash, he was pointing to all of the signs that such a crash was coming. He wasn't stupid. He didn't claim that he could tell you what month or what day it would happen. That would be ridiculous. But he understood that any reasonably balanced assessment of where the economy was had to look at all of the signs, and they were many, of danger, of risk, of loss. Instead, we had a country in massive denial. And the economists' profession, this is their crime. They participated in the denial. They didn't have the backbone, they didn't have the confidence, and they didn't dare to jeopardize their corporate connections and their government connections by saying clearly. For example, and this is harsh, but there's no way out of this, during the Obama administration, liberal economists had to go along with the notion that everything was great and we were recovering and all of this other stuff, leaving it only to hucksters on the right wing, like Donald Trump, to attack all of that. The economy isn't great, Trump said. The economy is in danger. The statistics are all lying. Now, I'm not saying that Trump wasn't doing the same thing, and he has indeed reversed himself. He's now doing the defensive claim of greatness that Obama did. But we on the left, we said also there were terrible problems, just as today we say that this economy is far from great, that it is in enormous danger. We point to the signals. We take no great satisfaction in it because we live again in an America which seems to want to need denial as the way of coping. And the reality is that the only historical model I can see for this kind of behavior is what we associate with declining empires, whether it's the Greek or the Roman or the British. They don't want to face, after they've had a wonderful run up to be a great empire, they don't want to face the overwhelming signs that they're over the hill and they're on the way down. The British to this day can't face that their empire is now 100 years behind them. And the Americans don't seem to be willing to face the reality that they're following suit.
And I think, and again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff, I think that problem is compounded, and here I'll get in trouble a little bit, by the fact that I think a lot of people who are Democrats and essentially liberal want to fall in line behind what a Democratic president did, what a future Democratic nominee might do. And if they say the economy is getting better under Democratic president, there are going to be people who just want to agree with that, even when it's objectively not true, and even when the price of falling in line is a President Trump. So, but having said that, since you mentioned decline of empire and the British Empire in particular, before we let you go, Richard Wolff, I did want to talk to you about the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn, the election in Great Britain. It is astonishing to me and depressing, frankly, because if one looks at the polling in Great Britain, you see enormous support for the very left-wing agenda that Jeremy Corbyn represented and brought to the Labour Party, which had become somewhat centrist, as you know. And yet you have all these emotions around Brexit. You have the personal smear attacks that the media amplified against Mr. Corbyn. You have many factors involved, but one of them to me that I was curious and wanted to talk to you about, it kind of ties in with not only Empire, but Bill Greider and his battles with Krugman and others on globalization, is I was very curious to get your thoughts on it. It seems to me, in Great Britain, you have Remainers who want to stay in the European community, which in many ways to me is an artifact of globalization. You have Leavers on the right who want to restore a England of the past or whatever, with a taste of nationalism and perhaps some unsavory things there too, and more unsavory, I should say. And then you have the left exit, Lexit or whatever they call it, the left Leavers. And Corbyn kind of tried to play both sides of that. I think that hurt him a little bit. What are your thoughts on the whole Brexit question and how it affected Great Britain? I fear for Great Britain's future now, but what are your thoughts on that whole situation?
Well, first of all, I share your sadness, your regret, your feeling down by what happened to the Labour Party there. I share that. And I share it mostly because of the program. They called it the manifesto, the Labour manifesto that they put out in the months before, the weeks before the election. It's a remarkable document. I have read it. It is one of the more advanced proposals for social and economic development that any out-of-power party, major party in the Western world has produced. Far superior to anything that the Democratic Party of the United States has put out, at least in my lifetime. More progressive, more worked out, more reflective of mass contributions. It's a real model. But I think the election showed that the Labour Party and Mr. Corbyn, if they're to be criticized, it is they were not able to make that program the centerpiece of that election. They faced a uniform hostility from the press, that are big corporations and that are afraid of a Corbyn presidency, rather like the corporations are now gearing up in hostility to Sanders, et cetera, et cetera. They worked ceaselessly against him, portraying him as crazy, as a cult figure, as someone who's going to wreck the British economy, as an anti-Semite, all kinds of things, more or less reaching God knows where to have something negative to say. And Mr. Johnson did the clever political thing. He didn't engage with the program of the Labour Party. He refused to be basically in the race, hoping that between what the media said badly and what he could focus people on, namely Brexit, would dominate the determination of what you vote for when you go into the booth. And Mr. Johnson proved that was the case. Having said so, what then did decide the voting? And the answer is Brexit. Mm-hmm. And here is the most important thing, both for Britain and for the parallel here in the United States. Since the crash of 2008, the suffering of the British working class has been markedly greater than that of the United States. Real wages here have been basically stagnant, but real wages in England have declined 10 to 15% between 2008 and the current. Try to imagine the difficulties being felt by so many Americans as their wages go nowhere and as the gap between rich and poor gets worse, and multiply it by the British experience, which is markedly worse. Capitalism has a problem when it works only for the 10% at the top, and when it makes the life of the vast majority harder and harder. And using lots of theatrics, whether it's by Mr. Johnson or by Mr. Trump, only goes so far. You can't eat theatrics, you can't wear theatrics, and they don't provide much shelter from the rain. And so after a while, the capitalist system has to come up with some way of coping with the grotesque inequality that it is producing. And it then turns, and has done this many times in its history, to nationalism, to a toxic kind of nationalism, in which the suffering that people feel is acknowledged. This comes after years in which it's denied, but now it's acknowledged, but in a particular way. It is somebody else's fault.
Right.
It is the immigrant. It is the foreign country that's cheating us when we trade with them. It's the foreign country that's stealing our intellectual property or secrets or technology. It's the foreigner, the foreigner, the foreigner. At first, it's the foreigner far away, and then pretty soon it becomes the foreigner that has sneaked into our midst. And then we become self-consuming as we hunt out the bad people and exterminate them in one case, expel them in another. It is a kind of hysteria of projection, a hysteria of finding a scapegoat. And the scapegoat mentality has worked. And that's all Brexit is. You British people are suffering. What are they suffering from? A capitalism that crashed in 2008, a capitalism that then gave an enormous bailout to the people who brought the crash, a point that William Greider made repeatedly. And finally, a government and a system that imposed austerity on the mass of the people, the victims of the crash, having taken their tax money to bail out the causes of the crash. It is so outrageous that in order to deflect anger, you have to become as outrageous with another target, a scapegoat. And the foreigner in the position of immigrant, the foreigner in the position of another country, particularly a country that you can bash because most of your people know very little about it, hence the popularity of bashing China or something else like that. It's pathetic. It is very dangerous. In the aftermath, let me remind everyone, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the right-wing populist, fascist, strongman reaction, Hitler in Germany, Mussolini already in power, getting worse in Italy, the leadership in Japan, the leadership in Spain and Portugal, they became the worst scourge in history. Now, after the crash of 2008, we once again see the rise of this kind of scapegoating first, moving on to the demonization of the other. And that's a system so desperate, so eager to deny the economic roots of its difficulty that it will sacrifice unlimited numbers of people before it faces what the real issues are.
Well, on that note, which I would say also describes an empire in decline, we
Yes.
will we will have to stop. Professor Richard Wolff, professor of economics and host of the program Economic Update. As always, we very much appreciate your insights and thank you for joining us.
And thank you, RJ. I was glad to talk with you. And there are no more important topics than what you bring up. and my hat is off in appreciation.